So I wrote that you should bring in from last week the last two pages, which is actually a la Torah. But the reason why I'm learning it is because we've done so much work already with Reb Yaakov and the Geula and the Golus and Geula, that this is really the finishing touch in a sense. And all the work that we've done, I'm going to show you today. I could have really just written a chart how Reb Yaakov is going to be machaven to the Meshech Chochma in without exaggeration, in 10 places in one article. Okay, but Reb Yaakov is machaven in from a lot of different places that he wrote on to that one article on different aspects of the article. So yes, you know that one.
Yeah.
So I'll show you how Reb Yaakov was mamish machaven to it. We'll talk a little bit more about it before we do that piece. I actually underlined because I want to skip around there because I don't think, number one, we'll have the time, and number two, I just want to really show you certain ideas there that he's full of very interesting ideas there. Some of them are so contemporary, it's scary. Some of them were contemporary before World War II, but some of them are contemporary today as well. Something that when I learned that the first time, which was probably about over 50 years ago, I didn't think it was so contemporary, the parts that I think today are. But in any event, Reb Yaakov, the following article is something Reb Yaakov wrote, but it's part of it. A good part of it, he actually spoke out at the last Aguda convention that he went to, which was probably, I have a feeling, something like 1981 or 82, maybe 83, could be. Now, at that time, just to give you perspective, the Torah world, which I claim started about 1945 in America. In other words, there was Torah in America, Yeshiva University, Torah Vodaas, before the war, okay, before World War II. Yeshiva University was before World War I think, actually. Rabbi Yitzchak Shurin, the yeshiva, was before. But nothing really took off, including Yeshiva University. It didn't take off until after World War II. Then it took off, and for obvious reasons, because so many Jews came to America after the war. That's one of the reasons. It's probably even a main reason, but there's other reasons as well. So by the time Reb Yaakov spoke about this, it was already two generations of America. Okay, there were two. He was speaking to the second generation, right? These people were born in America, right? And they already had children who were grown up at the Aguda convention that were, born in America. They were born in America, and their children were born in America. But their kids were probably not at the convention. Maybe some of them were old enough to be at the convention. So that would have been really the beginning of a third generation, being like a teenager or something. And the reason why I'm telling you is to give you a little bit of perspective when you see this piece, how Reb Yaakov used it with regard to the people who he was speaking for at the Aguda. Reb Yaakov at that time was about 92 years old. Okay, so it says like this.
Can I just ask where we're starting from?
Yes. Last week I gave you, is it page 6 and 7?
Right, I got that, yeah.
Okay, good. So we're starting from the beginning. It's the beginning of Sefer Shmos, Ve'ela Shmos B'nai Yisrael. Now, the way I heard this from Reb Yaakov is a bit different, and there is another place where Reb Yaakov wrote about this, that the author here put it in a footnote, number 7, so we'll get to that footnote. But that's the way I heard it from Reb Yaakov. I think that was more like he said it at the convention, right? I heard it from Yaakov before the convention, but that's why I heard it from Reb Yaakov. But let's go through this one as well, okay? Ve'ela Shmos Shkulim. This is a Medrash Rabbah, Shmos Rabbah, right at the beginning of Shmos. Ve'ela Shmos Ve'ela Shmos B'nai Yisrael. It says Ve'ela Shmos Kulim Heim Yisrael Kitzavah Hashamayim, right? Kitzvah Hashamayim, like the stars of the sky, or like there's a fancier word for that, right?
Heavenly host.
The host, that's it. Got it. That's the fancier word. Right. Right. So the Medrash says, the Shvatim were or Klal Yisrael at that time was the Shvatim and whoever else was there, Kitzvah Shamayim, Nemar kan Shmos, Ve'ela Shmos B'nai Yisrael, V'nemar B'kochavim, Shemos, Shenemar Monem Mispar L'kochavim, L'chulam Shemos Yikra, right? So it says by the Kochavim that they were called, God called them Shemos, the Kulam Shemos Yikra. Af HaKadosh Baruch Hu Sheyardu Yisrael L'Mitzrayim Mona Misparim Kama Hayu. When the Jews went out to Egypt, God again, when the Jews went down to Egypt, meaning in Sefer Bereshis, Mana Misparam Kama Hayu, right? It goes through all the 70, children of Yaakov. Lefi shehem mishulim lekochavim kara shemos lekulam hadu dechtiv el shmos, and there, because they were compared to the stars, right? Therefore, they were called. How are they compared to stars? Like a sort of a hekish. I mean, Gzeira Shava, because here it says shmos, and there it says L'kulam Shemos Yikra, right? So it's a zab drash Gzeira Shava. It's not a halachic Gzeira Shava, but a drash Gzeira Shava, right? And that's what it means. Ve'ela Shmos is he again called he counted them before, and this is Ve'ela Shmos B'nai Yisrael above Mitzrayim, and it goes through the 12 tribes. It names them again, right? And Reb Yaakov really wants to know what the heck is this medrash talking about? It's a very nice little medrash, but you're comparing the Shvatim or the Kochavim, that you call them by names, and therefore over here you name the Shvatim again. Who cares? I mean, very nice, but what is this poetry or something? So Reb Yaakov says Hamelitza Bazeh means the interpretation, right? In other words, what are we comparing over here to the Shvatim, to the stars? Shekol Zman Yaakov Avinu Kayam Hayakashemesh Ve'ein Banav Nikarim Az. Yaakov was like the Shemesh. If you remember that when Yosef had the dream, he says Hashemesh V'Yereach V'Achadasar Kochavim, right? So Shemesh was Yaakov, and his wife was Yereach, right? When Yaakov was alive, he was the Shemesh of Klal Yisrael, right? Rabbi Yaakov was saying this in order to introduce you. The Medrash doesn't discuss Yaakov here, right? But Rabbi Yaakov was trying to understand here, what the Medrash is saying about the Shvatim being like the stars, right? When Yaakov was alive, he was like the Shemesh, and therefore, then the children are not so clear. You can't see them so easily because like stars, right? Just like a shemesh, when it's on its way down, sometimes you could see stars, but betokvo, when it's really out there shining bright and strong, right? You can't see the stars. The kivan sheshaka chama. And since the sun went down, meaning Yaakov passed away, where did he pass away? He passed away in Sefer Bereshis, right? So then the Kochavim begin to sparkle or shine, right? Notzitz, right?
Twinkle.
What did you say?
Twinkle.
Twinkle. I like that better. You're right. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. That's it. I actually never hopped that, Jonathan. I'm glad you told me that. I always knew the song "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," but I never hopped that the twinkle is about the star shining. Okay, good word. Okay. V'chol kama she'achoshech mitrabeh hakochavim murgashim biyoter. And the darker the night is, the kochavim shine even more. Meaning, I mean, we've seen this. If you live through, I don't know if you guys lived through it. Jonathan's from England and Baruch's from Canada, but in America we had a blackout, right? So I remember as a kid, I don't remember how old I was, but I was probably 10 or 11. There was a blackout in like half of America. And I remember the stars was so much more seen that night because there was absolutely no lights anywhere. I mean, not just in the house, there were no lights anywhere, right? So that's what Reb Yaakov was saying. Now, why does Reb Yaakov want to say that? What's the point of that? He's going to explain. And now, since we're about to go into the darkness of Egypt, the Golus, right? Manam Pam Sheni, the Torah counts them a second time. Why? Ukemo Kochavim, and like the Kochavim, meaning to stress the idea that they were like, the Medrash wants to say they were like the Kochavim, right? Because Yaakov died, and they were now the stars of the show. They were the twinklers right now, right? They were shining through in the beginning of B'chashecha Shel Mitzrayim, in the Golus of Mitzrayim. We'll soon see that Reb Yaakov, holds there's two aspects of Golus. If you're in a foreign land, you're in Golus, but you're not yet in a Golus that's Chashecha. Okay, here, take a look. V'nei zeh hizhir lahem b'chashechas hagolus. This shone for them. In other words, the banim, the tribes, shone for them in this chashecha. Chosmatra yeshvatim kayomim lo etchil adayin hashibud. According to Reb Yaakov, you have golus and the shibud hagolus. Okay, golus means when you're in the foreign land, right? Even if you're enjoying it, you're in golus. And then the Shibud Golus, which means you're not going to be having a party anymore. It's not going to be very nice to be there. Because these Kochavim, going back to the Shvatim, were even seen in the day, meaning where the sun wasn't shining so strong anymore because Yaakov died, but it wasn't night yet. It was still like, sometimes in Israel, you actually see it a lot. In New York, you never saw it because of the smog. But in Israel, you see it because at the end of the day, all of a sudden, you'll see stars before it's dark, right? So he says, Ki osem kochavim niru gam bayom, ki b'chalomo shel Yosef, shayadayin Yaakov Avinu chai, b'chol heim gam ke niru az kochavim. Because it says, in the dream, right? So you see that there were kochavim there. B'chol heim gam kein, meaning the shvatim, niru oz kochavim, v'chol kach hayiritzinut hachalom, and this chalom was so real, as we know, it was a nevuah, right? Ad shechazal, Sharaben Seinu Zechron Levracha Amru Sheruvein Hikir Tov Yosef. Eventually, when they realized that this was the dream that came true, it says in the Medrash in the Chazal that Ruvain was Makir Tov to Yosef. Shenodelo al Yado Ki Gam Hu Ben HaKochavim Nimneh. That he was amongst the Kochavim. He wasn't sure he would get in there, Ruvain, because of different, things that happened. But he was very happy to see he was one of the Kochavim. That's what the Medrash says. So Reb Yaakov was using that to show that the Kochavim were already shining in Yosef's dream, even while the sun and moon were going. The Or Kochavim Nami Orhu. And the Or of Kochavim is also Or, even though I think we say, right, Jonathan gets its Or from the sun, correct?
No.
Where does it get it from?
The moon and planets do, but the stars are shining by themselves.
Oh, stars too.
The stars are shining by themselves. The moon and the planets get their light from the sun.
From the sun. Okay, so here it's even better. For or kochavim nami arhu, right? Kochavim, it's real R, right? V'heir lahem es chashechas hagolos, and it lightened for them, and brightened up for them the chashechas, the darkness of golos. Aflacher petiras Yaakov Avinu. What the Medrash is saying is that the Shvatim kept the lights on even after the Shemesh went down. They had, their own light, and they kept the Golas at a certain level, okay, which we'll talk about. Rak acharei shekol adorahu meis kam hamelech hachadash b'hovenes chakmal shalo. A new melech got up, right? After the whole generation died, V'yomas Yosef, V'chol Achav, V'chol Adorahu, right? V'yokem El Chodosh Al Mitzrayim, right? Haven is Chakmalo, V'oz Be'emes HaYechoshech Mamish, right? That's what the Medrash is saying, that as long as the tribes were alive, there was still light, meaning there was no real Shibud yet in Mitzrayim. Once there was, they died, the choshech became so strong that already now Paro got up, right, and he made this new Melech Hadash, and he made all the Gzerot, for which that's where the Jews became Meshubad already, as opposed to just being Galut. Ubiyat Dvarimhu Ki Agolas Toli B'Makabel. This was Reb Yaakov's way of defining it. It sounds a little like a brisker, right? The Galut depends upon how you makabel it. Depends on the makabel. Us, how we makabel the galut depends on how strong the galut is going to be and how difficult it's going to be. V'hainu the chozman shezaro shel Avram Avinu chashvu atzmon legolim. That is, that as long as the children of Avram thought of themselves as being in Golut, Eretz Miyuchedet, in the fact that they don't have an Eretz Miyuchedet, they don't have a specific land. Irgishu Atzmam Golim B'Mesheim Tzrichim Leishev Be'eretz Tmeya, or they felt themselves Golim as people in exile, in the fact that they were dwelling in a defiled land. That's Mitzrayim. But the first half, She'en Lahem Eretz Miyuchedet, is even in Eretz Yisrael, which is a little bit of a steer to Reb Yaakov, because Reb Yaakov held that they already had Eretz Miyuchedet, because Yosef says, Ganov Gunafti me Eretz HaIvrim. So you see that they had an Eretz Miyuchedet. So here it's not so clear what Reb Yaakov wants. What one thing is true is that even though they had a land, they didn't consider Eretz Yisrael theirs yet. They had like a small portion, right, that they lived in. I'm not sure that they viewed it as theirs or not, right? But there's certainly, Eretz HaIvrim certainly sounds like, and that's what Rabbi Yaakov says. So this has to be clarified. Yotzu bazeh yidei chovas golas. With this, they fulfilled their obligation to goals, meaning the fact that they felt in a strange land in Mitzrayim, right? That was enough of a goals for them, because again, it's totally been makabel, and if you makabel the goals as if you don't belong there, that's enough. Or in Eretz Yisrael, as if it's not yours yet, that's enough. Darei al kol panim hirgushu et atzmam megolas. In any event, they treated themselves like they felt the golas, right? Even in the good times in Mitzrayim, right? Aval kishameis achron hashvatim regishu ki'ilu nifrad hakesher beineim ubein Eretz Canaan. When the shvatim and the whole dorahu that came from Eretz Canaan, right? The new generation stopped feeling themselves, right? There was a separation. As you recall, that's why Yaakov was so strong about Menashe and Ephraim, right? Because he wanted them to be connected to Eretz Yisrael. And Reb Yaakov even says that's why he said that, you have to get buried in Eretz Yisrael. I want to be buried in Eretz Yisrael, so they'll have that connection to Ephraim and Menashe because they already grew up in Egypt. So the same thing is true about the rest of the Jewish people. After those 70 that came down, the new generation, they grew up in Egypt already. So, Ukeilu Makomam Hu b'Mitzrayim. And already they started feeling that their place is in Egypt. In other words, Reb Yaakov doesn't go into it, but it sounds almost like psychological. When you're born in a certain country, you feel differently than the greenhorn that came to the country, right? And it doesn't matter if the country's treating you great or not, okay? My wife likes to say that my mother and father, right, went from Lita to Eretz Yisrael, and the 40 years they spent in America, it's like as if it didn't count, okay? Because even though my father and mother enjoyed America, it has nothing to do with the fact that you're having a harsh time. America, for them, after Lithuania, was like, you couldn't imagine. Like, just about every Jew came from the late 1800s till probably the 1990s or something, maybe the year 2000, felt very much at home, and they're being treated tremendously in America, right? But as opposed to myself and my brothers, we felt very American, right? My father and mother didn't feel American. They felt that they were coming from a foreign land, right? And being treated well in the new land, right? So that's why Esther used to say, like, your parents never lived in America. They lived in Lithuania, and then they lived in Israel, but never in America. Even though in reality, of course, they did, right? But my father, had the accent, and he didn't have the culture. He forced himself to watch a baseball game, so maybe he would understand it a little bit, But, he didn't have, like today, I don't have to tell you, a kid in America, even if he grows up in a Haredi home, he knows what the Mets are doing. He knows what the Yankees are doing. If he's in New York and LA, he knows what the Dodgers are doing, right? And some of the football teams and some of the basketball teams as well, right? Because they feel much more American, right? And the Gemara says that they began, it's not a Gemara, excuse me, I think it's a Medrash, I don't think it's a Gemara. V'tchilu levatel Brit Milah, and they started being Mavatel Brit Milah, right? Again, why did they Mavatel Brit Milah? Because Milah wasn't part of Hashkafas Mitzrayim, right? If anything, Hashkafa Mitzrayim was not to do Brit Milah. Not only they didn't do Brit Milah, but not to do it. So they started feeling like, I'm an Egyptian, right? I'm an Egyptian first, then a Jew, right? Oz hutzruchu legalot yoter kasher, oz hutzruchu legalut yoter kasher, b'chtei shal yishkachu et tzur machtzavtam. Then they needed a more serious, difficult galut, in order they shouldn't forget, right, where they're carved from, right, where they're yud from, from they're from Avram Avinu. They're not from Chum or from Mitzrayim. Then this real shibud started. Before it was a golut without a shibud. Now it's a golut with a shibud. And the shibud got worse and worse and worse until Vatal Shavatam Ada Shamayim, right? That's already when, before Moshe comes, God hears their wailing, and he says he has to bring the Geula. So basically, Reb Yaakov's yisod here is that Galut is totally in the Makabel, and when he spoke in the Agudah convention, he said there are people sitting here that still remember Eastern Europe, right? And they're still not so comfortable in America. And yet there are people sitting here that are getting very comfortable in America. And of course, the third generation was even more comfortable in America. And Reb Yaakov was telling these people from Agudah, right? Don't forget you're in the Galut. Don't forget, because if you forget, what has to happen? The Galut has to become more serious, right? And that reminds you, right? So Rabbi Yaakov here is talking about, they actually were Mavatal Brit Mila. And again, I want to take you back to what Rabbi Yaakov said. Rabbi Yaakov said, wait a minute, they're Mavatal Brit Mila, and then they didn't change their garments, and they didn't change their language and their names, right? It doesn't make any sense. You remember Rabbi Yaakov spoke this out in Sefer Tehillim, right? So he says, it's not a stira. You could be Mavatal Brit Mila, but nationally, you still have certain things. You want to dress like a Jew. You want to you want to speak the language, right? You want to, speak the Hebrew language. You want to keep a Hebrew name, right? He says they were assimilated, but they were also at the same time nationalistic as a Jew. Like that's the famous question that President Trump asked Dr. Miriam, what's the name of the woman was married to the guy who owned all the gambling joints. Adelson. What was his first name? I forget his first name, but it was Adelson, I think. Right?
Sheldon.
Sheldon, right? Sheldon, good old Sheldon. So when Trump came to Israel,
nationalistic is probably more cultural.
Well, what?
They're just cultural Jews.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. But she's Israeli, so she had more than him.
No, I'm talking about in Mitzrayim.
What?
In Mitzrayim, they were just cultural Jews. They weren't nationalistic Jews.
Exactly. So when Trump was here, he was speaking in the Knesset. I don't remember what he came for already because he comes all the time. I don't know, but he was here and he looked in the audience. He saw Miriam, and he said to her, Miriam, don't forget, I asked you what comes first, being Jewish or Israeli, and I remember what you said. He didn't say what you said, but I remember what you said, right? So even though Miriam's quite assimilated, but she probably told him, I'm Jewish before I'm an American, which, of course, that's what they're using today in America, right? All those anti-Semites are really using in America the what do you call it? This idea that Tucker Carlson, ask a Jew, he's going to say he's first Jewish, then American, right? Ask an Italian, he'll say he's first American and then Italian, right? So this is what Reb Yaakov said over there. And it could be, it's, in order to keep them from assimilating, right? Because they were assimilating, even if they were nationalistic still, they were assimilating. So, of course, the Golus became tougher. And when the Golus becomes tough, right, you start realizing, I don't belong here. I'm not being treated like everybody else. I'm being treated like a slave, right? So I really don't belong here, right? Of course, the Jews in Eastern Europe also felt like that. In Eastern Europe, they felt after being there 500 or 600 years. I think in Poland, there was 600 years, in Lithuania, about 500 years, right? All of a sudden, the Lithuanians turned on them when Hitler came in, right? And they told them, like, this is not your home anymore, right? This is, you're gone. And by the way, in Vienna, my Esther's grandfather came back after the war to his apartment, and the maid was living there. The maid who worked for him was living, and she wouldn't let him in. She would not let him in. All he wanted to do was actually get pictures of the family, and she wouldn't give it to him. She had them, she wouldn't give it to him. So it tells you, like, this guy lived in Vienna before the war, like as one of the citizens of Vienna, and all of a sudden after the war, he comes back, he doesn't have a house anymore. And this happened in Poland as well. So in some cases, they killed the Jews who try to go back into their house, right? And the Chappelles, Mrs. Chappelle couldn't get her house back. With all the lawyers and all the money, she could not get her house back in Poland, So it really tells you, right, where you belong or where you don't belong, right? V'yuvam bazeh madisa b'Rosh Hashanah kol dodi hinei ba medaleg al erim v'schut avos v'kapetz al gvos b'schus imahos. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says, darshans that medaleg al ha'arim, that's the avos, and mekapetz al gvos, that's the imos, ayin sham, right? Because, of course, Reb Yaakov is going to go into the fact the avos felt in Golus, even though they were living in Eretz Yisrael. They didn't feel like it's their land yet. And certainly Yaakov felt like very much in Golus when he left Eretz Yisrael, whether he went to Lavan or he went to Mitzrayim. and therefore God didn't have to turn in the screws at all. It's totally in the makabel. If you're feeling the golus, okay, that's good enough for you. Because what does it mean if you feel the golus? You know you don't belong here. V'tzorach bir. Dim haya reshus l'dalei al dalad me'od shana. If God had permission to skip over the 400 years, Shama Brisbane Absorum, he said 400 years, right? If God had permission to do that, why does he have to start from Yitzchak? Let him just skip years. God can do anything. So why does he say, I'm going to make it 400 years because it's not really 400 years, but from Yitzchak it's 400 years. So why do you have to start from Yitzchak? You don't need to keep your cheshbonot. It says in the pasuk, midaleg al ha'orim, right? Midaleg al ha'orim makabetz al ha'gvos. So you see that God does that. So what does he need to make calculation? Let him just jump. So Reb Yaakov says, "V'im ein lo reshus kaviyachol make shekar zochu at oso zman yoshvei haaretz." And if he didn't have permission, so to speak, to do it, it's obviously kaviyachol. God could do anything. Mepnei shekvar zochu at oso zman yoshvei haaretz, because the inhabitants of the land already were given that land, meaning the Shivas Umos were given, right? Ech tehanei zchus avos. How will it help the zchus of avos to do this? If they were already zoch in the land, so how does the zchus avos do this? If they were zoch in the land for that amount of time, how does the zchus avos change that? Vanirali lefi mashakasav, mashakasafti, that kol tolui b'makabel. In other words, the avos being who they were, right, and how they felt, how they related to the land of Israel. That Yaakov said, that Avram said, "Ger v'toshov anochi imachem." I have to buy a kever, right? Since he felt he didn't 100% belong in Eretz Yisrael in the sense of he was under the rule of the Canaanites, right? Lo lahem, they was in Eretz lo lahem already, right? Ephron said, right? Yitzchak came more powerful than Avimelech, but that has nothing to do with the Galut. The Jews, as being accused, are always powerful, right? Today they're being powerful, they're controlling Trump, right? AIPAC is controlling the whole America, according to people over the last couple of weeks, right? Avalafi gadlusam nechshav lehem legolos. According to their greatness, right? They were on the level that they felt the golut, even though they were in Eretz Yisrael. V'zeh pshat b'schus avos, kloma b'schus gadlus avos, shirgishu atzo begolos nechshav oter hashem gamkein kegolos. In other words, the other 190 years that Avram, Yitzchak lived through, and Yaakov, they felt, right, already that they felt like the Israel doesn't exactly belong to them. They want to live in Eretz Yisrael, but they're living under British rule, right, not under their own rule, right? So therefore, it was considered golus, and it counted. The years counted. So when it says in the Medrash, right, it means God didn't jump because he decided to jump. He was able to jump because he was able to consider Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov in Golus, right? What's interesting, by the way, is that Shimon and Levi already don't feel like they're in Golus so much, right? Yaakov didn't want them to attack the Canaanites over there in Shechem and Hamor, but they felt already, this is our land. We're not going to let them, fool around with us. They're not going to take advantage of us, right? But Yaakov didn't feel that way. So you see, Yaakov felt that, and therefore the Golus Mitzrayim could have started already from Yitzchak, from Brisbane Absarim, or from Yitzchak, right? That's what Reb Yaakov's idea. Now, there's a B'signon Acher in Numbers Dalet. It says here, B'signon acher. This is what I heard from Reb Yaakov. Okay, this little piece, that's how I heard it from Reb Yaakov. Umizeh atam be'emes hitchila hagolus mishenolad Yitzchak. Ki be'emes kasher ba ish me'eretz mesuyemes, like somebody comes from a certain land, umityashev be'eretz acheres, he comes from one land and he now lives in another land. Ein zeh keneged hayosher sheyitchashev rak ger. It doesn't go against the Seichel HaYosher that he should not be anything more than a ger, right? Ki sof sof ein bo rikshe aval eretz moshavo. Because at the end of the day, in this new land, he doesn't have the feeling of love. If you ask my father, what did he love more, Lithuania or America? He'll tell you, I love Lithuania more. It's a chiddush, right? He'll tell you, because he had that connection. He grew up there, had the connection, he felt at home. Do I feel more at home in Jerusalem or in New York City, right? And the answer is, I feel at home in Jerusalem, but in certain ways, I still feel more at home in New York City. In certain ways, as time goes on, it gets less and less. But there's a certain familiarity that Reb Yaakov says, you grow up in America, you grow up in a nice life, you develop a certain emotional attachment. Ki adarabba, gaguav heim le'eretz moladato. His gaguim al eretz moladato. I'm sure if you asked Reb Yaakov, he would have said he has gagu Lithuania, even though he knows what those Lithuanian chalerias did, right? He still has it. And I'm sure the same thing was true someone who came from Warsaw, Krakow. There's no question about it. He grew up there. He remembers it. If these guys who go back to Krakow, right? Who have visited the camps, they haven't been there in 50 years. Then all of a sudden they go on this, what do they call it? That March of the Frum living, right? I never went back because my mother didn't want me to, right? So my mother was given a ticket to go back to Lithuania for free. Okay, you give it a ticket and she didn't take it. The guy wanted to give it for free, she wouldn't take it, right? But there are a lot of people that when they went back to Krakow and to Warsaw, they started to cry. It wasn't crying because what once was. It was crying because there was certain connection. That's what Rabbi Yaakov here is saying. When he meets someone from his hometown, right, he has a tremendous simcha, right? He hasn't seen this guy. He moved to Canada, and then all of a sudden he sees another guy from Warsaw, who, by the way, he didn't know. He didn't know the guy in Warsaw. Warsaw was a big place. There was probably a few 100,000 Jews in Warsaw, right? But he meets him and he says he feels like a long lost friend, right? But the child that's born there, he feels different. Naturally, he has no connection to the place that his parents came from. He knows about it. His parents spoke about it. My father always talked about Lithuania. Reb Yaakov always talked. So I feel a certain connection, but he says he doesn't have that natural connection. For us, Lefia Yashris haben tzarich litchashev keben hamedina. Then he feels like, I come from England, I come from America, I come from Canada, right? V'afal pikein gam Yitzchak Avinu hayenechshav ger ba'aretz v'arezu golus ulefikach mishenol Yitzchak hitchil minyan hagolus begeder onish. And therefore, Yitzchak, who was on a high level, he was able to feel golus while living in Eretz Yisrael, right? Because it wasn't theirs yet. He was able to feel that uncomfortableness, so to speak, and therefore it starts counting from him. Even though Yitzchak was born there. So Yitzchak should have been like Shimon and Levi, right? But no, Yitzchak felt still that it wasn't, he wasn't 100% comfortable, therefore the goal could start with him. Whereas the new generation gets very comfortable. And as soon as the new generation gets comfortable, that's when the goal is really gets very tough. And that's what we're seeing now, right? We're seeing things in America that we couldn't imagine would happen, right? And
Why couldn't
what?
Why couldn't God start with Avraham Avinu? He's also a stranger in a strange land.
That's true. So some people learned that it was 430 years. It started with the Bris Bein Absarim. Rabbi Yaakov was just going with the idea of Yitzchak, right? With the Bris Bein, it starts with Yitzchak, but you're right. It's a good kasha. In other words, it should really start with Avram, with the Bris Bein Absarim, because that's when he was told it would be 400 years, right? And some Mepharshim learned he said 400 years, but it meant 430 years, but they sometimes in the Torah they round it off to the nearest, full. You see that in the Torah in a few places that they actually round things off, right? So I think you're right, Jonathan. The way Avram Avinu relates to the people, to the Ephron, Achiti, and also the Chazal say that he didn't want to take land for himself, right? That Avram Avinu already felt that way. So from the Bris Bein Absarim, it's 430 years, if I'm not mistaken, and we could really start from there as well. He's just going with a Chazal that says it starts from Yitzchak. And of course, on that Chazal, the kasha is, Jonathan's kasha is a good kasha. Like, why don't you start, why with Avram Avinu and not, why don't you start with Avram Avinu, right? Because Reb Yaakov himself said, even though they said, Nesiya Elokim Atah b'tocheinu, your mom is a prince of God in us, which sounds like he's pretty comfortable. They're pretty comfortable with him there. But yet, Reb Yaakov does say that even from Avram Avinu, he wasn't 100% comfortable. But certainly the people growing up in America feel extremely comfortable, right? They feel very, very comfortable with being in America. Even the frum people, they feel as comfortable as the secular people. The only difference is that they're not marrying out as much. Okay, that's the only difference, right? But otherwise, they feel very comfortable. Now, I want to show you that the Meshech Chochmah actually says everything that Reb Yaakov said, but Reb Yaakov gives it a concept. He says it's totally b'makabel, whereas the what do you call it? The Meshech Chochmah defines a whole historical what's the word? Narrative. A whole historical narrative here. He does it beautifully. I don't know of anyone who does it this beautiful. He goes through the whole Jewish history in a few pages, showing what the Golus always becomes every time. And as you're reading it, you see that this is what Reb Yaakov said, and this is what Reb Yaakov said. And I want to tell you something. I don't remember what the context was. I have to tell you. I was in a little bit of shock when Reb Yaakov told me this. Okay? Reb Yaakov told me in Achronim I'm machavin to the Meshech Chochmah and the Or Sameach, Ramei Simcha. This is what he told me. In Achronim I'm always machavin to him. In the Rishonim, now I may have said that. What about the Rishonim? And I was just making fun of Reb Yaakov. I was just saying, what about in the Rishonim? I thought Reb Yaakov would say, how can I be machavin to someone in the Rishonim? He right away said to me, I'm machavin always to the Ra'ah, Rabbi Aaron Halevi. I almost fell off my chair. And not because he's machavin to the Ra, because he figured out that he's machavin to the Ra after he saw the Rabbi Aaron Halevi so many times. I happened to be learning Sanhedrin, and the Ran, if I'm not mistaken, may quote Rabbi Aaron Halevi. I don't remember exactly in Sanhedrin. I was learning something, and we started talking about Rabbi Aaron Halevi. He says in the Rishonim, I'm machavin to Rabbi Aaron Halevi, right? I mean, to know who you're machavin to, I mean, that's pretty good. You got to really have learned a lot of that, and also have kept a cheshbon. Like, I seem to always be machavin to the Rabbi Halevi and the Meshech Chochmah. So here it's very clear that he was machavin. He told me many other times that he was machavin to the Or Sameach, and sometimes I found it in the Or Sameach al Rambam. I also found times when he had a different approach than the Or Sameach, but a lot of times he did. So he says over here, the Or Sameach says like this. Ha'inyan hushen is boning. You see where I start? right? I didn't start from the pasuk because we're not going into the pasuk. Let's look into the ways of the Hashgacha Elyona a little bit, what we're able to understand, meaning you're never going to understand the Hashgacha completely, but there's parts you can understand, and he's going to show you which parts. V'zeki kasher gozra chachma Elyona asher Yisrael yitnodudu ba'artzot shanim rabos ma'od ma'od, when it was decreed, the wisdom of God decreed that the Jewish people should wander in lands many, many years, which of course that is the last 2,000 some odd years, until the time that God, the time that God enacted, in His goal for the Jewish people. Asher liba lepuma logalia. That's an expression in the Gemara. Actually, I think it's an expression in Medrash. I don't remember in the Gemara. Liba lepuma logalia means the lave to the mouth doesn't reveal. In other words, what the lave knows, it doesn't get to the mouth, right? Meaning there's certain things we'll never know, right? Like when the Gul is supposed to be. I know every week someone tells you when the Gul is supposed to be here in Israel. I see every week someone say, "Oh, this happened, and now it's going to be. Oh, this is Milchemes Gog Magog, and this and this." And then 3 weeks later, you find out it's not, and then you forget who the guy is because you want to write him a nasty letter, but you forget who he is, right? Chashva ofanim v'tachpulot, the hashgacha thought of ways and clever tachpulot, like clever ideas. Asher Yisrael yitkaim l'goy v'lo yitbolu b'amim. How the Jews will exist amongst the nations, and they won't assimilate, because normally that's what's supposed to happen, right? V'he'ira al zeh godel ha'uma la'sos b'zeh gedar musyagim. And the great one of the nation made for this gedarim usyagim, fences, right? Asher ha'uma titkayem b'sha'on galei hayam, that the nation, Jewish people, will exist in the roaring waves of the Yam, which is a metaphor, obviously, for being driven all over. V'lo titba b'mpsulos hasar hashotef b'ruach hamitzvah kabir, and he won't drown, right, in the depths of those storms and floods. Hashotef, that floods, the storms that flood with a strong wind and a strong and mighty wind, right? In other words, that's what's happening to the Jewish people in Galut, what he just described in a lot of adjectives. V'hinei, harishon ha'mora derech u'melamed roshei ha'uma. Who was the first one to make these gedarim, right? Hu Avinu Azok Yaakov. Yaakov was the first one, not Avram, not Yitzchak, Yaakov. Number one, Yaakov was always in Galut, so he had to make Zerot for himself. And then when the Jews went out to Egypt, Asher Yikro Tanu B'Achros Hayamim, Yaakov is actually able to see, right? It says in Parshas Vayechi, right? He wanted Bikush legalotet what do you call it? The ketz, right? He saw what's going to be. Chashav asher im shivim ish b'goy chazak v'amitz. He thought if there'll be 70 people in the middle of a strong, vigorous Kimitzrayim l'fnim, like a vigorous country like Egypt, like it was. Obviously, if you have 70 people, the chances of them assimilating are like 99.9. Okay? With the Jews, before the Jews came from Europe in 1945, Jews were assimilated like crazy here because there were very little Jews and a lot of non-Jews. Tachbula ve'etzah. He thought of a good plan. In other words, tachbula is, in other words, a
Stratagem.
What?
Stratagem.
A strategy. Good. That's a good strategy. Ve'etzah. Asher banav yiyu mitzuyanim sham bebegadehem uv'shemosam. He claims that Yaakov thought this, right? We always say they never changed, but no one ever talks about who thought of this idea not to change. So he says that was Yaakov. That was the Gzeira of Yaakov. You got to dress this way. You gotta, talk this way. You got to have Jewish names. Then the Jews became a separate nation. They lived separately in a little ghetto, and they had separate, minhagim. Vim haya Yaakov avi kol shiftei Yisrael kavur sham, halo hayu b'tyayishim me'eretz Canaan, v'hayu mishtakim b'Mitzrayim, u'machshivim oso le'eretz moladatam. If Yaakov would not have been buried in Eretz Canaan, right? What would have happened? The Jews would have been absorbed in Egypt. If he would have been buried in Egypt, and they would have thought exactly what Reb Yaakov said. We're citizens of Egypt, right? This is the land of our birth, because that's where they were born. And the destiny that God made for the Jewish people would become annulled. So that's why Yaakov said to the Jewish people, and Rabbi Yaakov wrote this in the last article we read, that Yaakov said, I'm going back to Israel, dead or alive, so to speak. When I die, I'm going back to Israel, which shows that's the place that you guys have to look to be eventually. Right? Ki lo yiyeh Avram rak chelik echad me'am Mitzrayim, because if Yaakov didn't do this, then he didn't want, right? He didn't want lo yiyeh Yaakov. He didn't want the children of Avram to be like one part of the nation of Mitzrayim. Just like today in America, you have the Italians and the Irish, and you have the Jews. He said, you got to bury me there. And they'll know their yichus is buried Canaan. Okay? Skip over the bracket because I want to finish up. Kishur TV lishtokek el eretz avosehem v'lachshov atzmom ki gerim. And that through all that Yaakov enacted, that's what gave the Jewish people the feeling, the longing after, right? Lishtokek, to land of their forefathers. V'zev hayoger sham, we say it in the, what do you call it, right? In the Gadash al Pesach, Vayoger sham malamed shelo yarad Yaakov avinu l'shtakeya el lagur sham. Yaakov didn't go down to settle there, only to be a wayfarer there. Pirish Malamed Ledoros. What does it mean, Malamed? It teaches all the Doros. B'chol Golos v'Golos. It's a nice idea of the Meshech Chochmah. He says, what does Malamed mean? It's teaching who? It's teaching all of us for all generations. Right? Hanhaga sheyedun shelo yerdu l'shtakei lak lagur ad bo Ketz hayamin, until the Ketz hayamin. Right? The end of days. V'yu Mechashvim be'enei atzmam lo ke'ezrachim. V'chein tziva Yosef pakod yifkod elokim eschem v'alisem es atzmosai mizeh. Right? V'chein kol hashvatim shebazei nichu shorish gadol b'leiva of Yisrael. Okay? V'lechein, now he learns a new pshat. V'yakutzu b'pnei b'nei Yisrael shayu nechshavim be'neim kikotzim. Do you remember how the Rebbe declared us? That the Jews were like kotzim, like thorns in the eyes of the Egyptians, right? The Rebbe always gave this idea, right, that the Jewish people were like always like, very popular, and that put like a coats in their eyes. The Meshech Chochmah says that's not the pshat, a new pshat. Shekemosha coats eina nisbach v'osa shorashim b'shar nita'im ve'lonos. Just like the coats, which is the what do you call it? the thorn, doesn't get entangled and make shorashim in the other nita'im v'ilanos. Keino yu nechsham Yisrael shalodimu atatzmal l'mitzrayim v'yu nifradim b'tchunosei v'argoshosam ad ki oyu beinei ha'mitzrim kikotes. It wasn't in their eyes, literally. They looked at the Jewish people as a coats, a foreign product. That's kikotzim. It's a gewaltig new pshat. He says in this idea of a yakutsu b'pnei b'nei Israel. Right? It doesn't mean that they were like thorns in their eyes, literally. It means before their eyes, they were like kotzim. They were different. Umizel lamdu gdolei uma v'rosham Ezra v'anshe knesa gdola shegodru v'siagu uma b'yudches dover libadel min hagoyim b'chol darchechem. And that's why Ezra, when Ezra came, he made all those gzeros. This goes back to Reb Yaakov on Chagai. Why Ezra brought the people back to Yerushalayim, back to Eretz Yisrael, Yerushalayim, to make a Beis HaMikdash, which Reb Yaakov says was not supposed to be. Why did he do it? To make those gzeros, so when they go back to Galut, they'll have these gzeros. Here's the Meshech Chochmah saying it. Reb Yaakov goes much more in depth over there. She'edu Yisrael, kiyu achsanai v'ger be'eretz nachriya. That the Jewish people, I'm only a guest and a foreigner in the land, in this foreign land. And the Meshech Chochmah says, like the Gemara says, or the Mishnah says, shoots of zaytim are never mitarev. You never have with zaytim. You never have a problem of orla, because not orla of klayim, because their roots don't come together with other roots. And that was, Jewish people are always like the zaytim. Okay, go to the next page. And he says, okay, you know what? Let's stop here and we'll take this up after. I'd rather take some more time on this. We'll take it up. I think we're going to be, do you want to learn next week? Or you want to take off till El?
I'm happy to learn.
What?
I'm traveling, so I won't be able to.
Okay, so you know what? Let's take this up in El already. We'll miss a few weeks, and you'll be back by El?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So you know what? Let's hold off till Elul, and I want to finish this up because it becomes very nugeya, not to people from 50 years ago, but to us mamish today. What's going on today? Because what happens is, I'll just give you the preview, is that in the most frum areas, both in Israel and in America, kids are going off, which they didn't do when I was growing up. My class was 25 people. I don't think one kid went off. Okay? Today, all the time, kids are going off in Lakewood, in Muncie, in all the different frum areas, they're going off. And the question is why? And the Meshech Chochmah is going to try to explain it psychologically. And I think it's a very important idea that we see it. I'd like to hear what your opinion is, whether you agree, but he's going to try to explain all that, that after a certain amount of generations, the kids start to rebel. He has a very interesting idea why they start to rebel. But it's all psychological over here. There's no question about it. I think even Rav Cooperman tries to put it into psychological terms when he has his commentary on the bottom. Okay, so we'll stop here.
Does he also talk about further generations coming back and attacking Am Yisrael? The very assimilated generations coming back and attacking Israel.
In other words, the Jews themselves attacking the Jews.
Yeah. The
Which
assimilated
is very,
ones.
it's like a big thing in America.
That's exactly what he talks about. He talks about that. Exactly. Okay, we'll stop here. We'll take it up. There's Hashem and El.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Rabbi
you very
Shurin.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Meaningful fast, everybody.